I'm Alex Graham Hagee, and welcome to Our Heritage. I hope during this program that we've been making it clear that history is not something that you just get out of books. It's also something to do with people and with places. And in fact, it's important to remember that sometimes the history is right around you and you may not immediately notice it. And to that end, I'm going to be talking to somebody today whose house has had quite a lot of history pass through it, as we'll see. And with that, I'll bring you to my guest, Mr. Frank Dabbs. Frank, how are you doing today?
Good to be here.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're from Annan, Ontario. That's right,
That's
just
right.
a ways outside Owen Sound.
That's right. That's
All
right.
And tell us a little bit about Annan. I've never been there, I don't think.
Well, Annan's better days are past. It was on the post road between Collingwood and Owen Sound in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So there were two hotels, a post office, a blacksmith, a school with 60 or 70 kids, a church.
Mm-hmm.
It was a fairly busy place.
When I grew up in Kimberley, which had a similar story. It's quite a sleepy place now, but likewise had two hotels and a blacksmith shop and all of this stuff. It was a very happening spot in its day. So it's
And we also had a mill, but that was a mile and a half from town. But
and so it had a pretty significant role to play at that time. And your house has had a bit of a story to tell. How did you come to be interested in your house's history?
I was looking for a place in Ontario for my wife and I to retire. And if anybody had been behind us the day we spotted the for sale sign on the manse said Annan, they would have run into us because we stopped and went in. And my wife was a fantastic gardener whose plants knew her name. And she walked through that garden, and in 45 minutes we were sold on the place just because of the English style 2-acre garden.
Nice.
And then we got, so as soon as we moved in, and it had been the Presbyterian manse for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the long story is when the Mackenzie Rebellion was over in 1837, the government began to survey Leith, the Irish Bloc,
Right.
Meaford, and so forth.
Yep.
And a guy named Nesbitt, a Scottish farmer, got one of the corners for his homestead and for his land grant. And then when he was in his 70s, he wanted to have a nest egg. So he subdivided the property and made 7 lots. And Robert Clark in 1860 bought this lot. And Robert Clark was a carpenter and his partner was a stonemason. And they built wagons and barns and houses.
Mm-hmm. And they were come in from Britain, did they not?
Well, they were Scotsmen
Mm-hmm.
from Perth.
Aha.
And Annan is a Scottish town. So the first language of Annan was Gaelic.
Aha, very nice.
And then when Robert Clark was quite successful, and his son John Clark, who learned the building trade from his father, was actually an architect and was one of the 2 architects who did the Carnegie Library,
Ah, very nice.
the Carnegie Hall.
Okay. Aha.
And so Robert and John left their legacy in stone and brick, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then Robert was an elder in the Presbyterian Church out at Annan.
Mm-hmm.
And when he came to Owen Sound to build some more houses, he sold the property to the church, and the church, it was the manse there for 100 years. So there are many people passed through, and they all had stories. And when I was the first 2 or 3 months that I lived in the manse, I was researching all these stories. And one day, one of my neighbors, one Saturday, Don and Heather Sutherland, knocked on the door, and I opened the door and I recognized them from the neighborhood. And I said, "You're the first live neighbors I've met."
Oh my goodness.
So, and one of the ministers was also a doctor, a physician.
Aha.
And he was in partnership. He formed a partnership with the family doctor in Annan.
Right.
And there's a midden on the yard, an old, where bricks and old metal and so on have been found. And I dug into that midden and found medicine bottles that James Fraser had left there.
Henry K. Wampole and Company. When I was an archaeology student, we were digging up this sort of thing in the GTA. So that is Have you looked to find out any of the Perth, Ontario? Funnily enough,
There is a
coincidence.
there is a collection of medicine bottles which the pharmacist at Owen Sound Hospital has put together. So, Rolly, his name is Roland. He knows
Okay.
quite a bit about these things.
All right.
And James Fraser got into a partnership with this physician and started doing his house calls. So he got a horse. He loved horses.
Right.
He got a horse, and he stabled the horse in a shed attached to our house.
Aha.
And these are horseshoes that I found when we tore the shed down to build an addition.
Very nice.
And
Okay.
these are from James Fraser's house calls.
Very nice.
You know, the first animals in Annan were oxen, because
Indeed.
they were the only ones big enough and heavy enough to uproot the big roots.
Right, of course.
So those were big trees, and so homesteaders would farm around the trees, grow barley and wheat and rye and whatever around the trees, and then
Yep.
they would peel the bark. These trees, I've got a 300-year-old maple on my yard, and it has a huge circumference. So to tear these down, the farmers would peel like 6 feet of bark, leave them for a couple of years till they started to rot, and then to take down a tree would take a crew a day. And the last thing was to uproot it, and a team of oxen would do that.
Very nice.
And that wood was cut up and brought down to the quay at Leith, the dock at Leith.
Yep.
And ships coming from Owen Sound Harbor that burned wood, steamers on the Great Lakes, stopped at Leith to fuel up
Yes.
for,
all right.
for quite a few years.
So the connections are all forming here. So it's astonishing to compare Annan, or where I grew up, Kimberley, as they are today with as they were then. There's this whole economy that's flowing between them.
And in the day, you couldn't go on the lake shore from Owen Sound to Leith. You had to come to Annan, and there was no road for quite a few years till between the two wars. And there was a bookkeeper at one of the hotels in Annan, who only went home to his home in Leith on weekends
Oh my gosh.
because he didn't want to walk through the woods after dark.
I can't
And that was
remember.
the trail.
That's certainly fair enough. And we're gonna get to dig some more into some of the details, but we're gonna just take a quick break first. And we're back. So, Frank, a few details. This is quite the epic that's revolved around your house. The house itself, it was on one of these subdivisions that was made out of the property in the area. What was the history of the actual building of the house?
Robert and his wife first lived in a wood frame house. And when they had money and John was on the way, their son was on the way, Robert, who was an ace house builder, built this red brick house, and up there we're on a beach cliff, so it's an old beach from 10,000 years ago when the glacier was melting, fairly flat. So he has the frames of the structure are actually resting on the stone.
Okay.
And all of the material came from the neighborhood. The bricks came from Leith. Some of the nails were made across the street in Robert Clark's brother-in-law's smithy.
Really?
And yes, these are. I think that
they're all
you've made these at Grey Roots.
I have had that pleasure, and it's interesting. It's his brother-in-law, so it's a close-knit community there.
Well, Robert was smart, and he married the school teacher's daughter.
Smart
So he
call.
married into the top of the leadership.
Right. I see.
And all of the material comes from Annan, and was the wood and so on were milled on the property as they built the house. Except we have a coal burning fireplace, which has on the asbestos insulation inside.
Oh.
It has Victoria. So it was from
okay.
Queen Victoria's era, obviously.
Okay, reused. Okay, and this would have been whenabouts that he would have built the
He built the house in 1880.
1880. Okay, and before that, it would have been for you and I have both been to Grey Roots. It would have been the original house before the brick house would have been a bit like the 1880s log house. That's the sort of a thing. Gotcha. Okay, and it strikes me that the obvious that the area must have been still quite a wild area. I mean, if this bookkeeper that you mentioned earlier had to be careful about walking at night in the woods, sort of thing. What drew Clark and his Davidson's, the stonemason? What brought them all the way from Scotland out into the bush, as it were?
Each of them got their journeymans in their trade in Scotland. And they came to Annan, first of all, because it was a Scottish community. Leith and Annan were Scottish. And secondly, it was the epic story of coming to the New World for a better opportunity at life. And Robert Clark, who was a very distinguished citizen of early Owen Sound and Annan, did very well financially, as well as practicing his trade. His houses and his barns are quite remarkable. I haven't ever seen any of his wagons. I don't suppose they're still around.
I don't suppose. Well, we can always hope. But so this new community starting up must have offered him better opportunities for upward mobility with because all of the basic stuff that needs to get built. Is that
exactly.
That was his idea? Okay. Well, it seems to have paid off.
And if you drive through Annan, the fieldstone houses that are there, I think there are 2 of them, maybe 3, were all built by James Davidson. He built the exteriors and Clark built the interiors.
Oh, I see. Okay. They made a good team then. All right. So how did we talk about James Fraser, the minister and physician? How did he come into the house? What was that process?
Well, he had been in Taiwan with the overseas foreign missioner, one of those.
Sure.
And his wife died in childbirth. So he came back to Canada, and he had grown up in Bondhead in Ontario.
Okay.
And the Presbyterian Church sent him to Annan. And he got his commission to come to Annan. And he stayed here until his retirement. And after his retirement, he wrote the lead editorial at the Owen Sound Sun-Times for 10 or 12 years until he died.
Okay. But how did he come in? How did he come to the house specifically?
Well,
how did that come about?
It's a great story because the Presbyterian Church was renting a house at Leith, and he had all these kids, and he wasn't very well accommodated, and the church wanted him to stay. So they had given a life interest in the manse across from the church. It was a wood frame building across from they'd given a life interest to their first minister, Robert Dewart, and he kept living.
Oh dear. Most inconsiderate of him.
So they needed something for James Fraser's family, and something that was obviously closer to Annan. So Robert Clark was an elder in the church and knew that he wanted to go to Owen Sound.
Okay.
So Robert Clark built the church at Annan, if you ever are out
indeed.
that way. That was
Okay.
one of the buildings he built.
Gotcha. Okay.
Built the old schoolhouse, which is now a private home as well. And but Robert sold the house to the church basically fairly cheap,
Okay.
fairly inexpensively, and he moved to Owen Sound, and Fraser moved from Leith to Annan.
So, in addition to helping out with the doctor's house calls, I gather that Mr. Fraser and the doctor were involved in a certain technological upgrade to Annan. Tell me about that.
Way ahead of its time. In those days, 1912, if you wanted a phone, you had to get, first of all, there were no long distance calls, but if you wanted a local phone, you had to get a bunch of subscribers, minimum of 12 subscribers.
Indeed.
So, and they would all chip in kind of a co-op. And Fraser and the doctor went around to the neighbors and got 10 more subscribers and put in a phone line. And when I was having my telephone upgraded, the telephone bell serviceman was down in the basement and very quiet for half an hour. So I went down to see what he was doing, and he was cleaning this ceramic and copper phone thing with a toothbrush. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "My guess is that this is the first phone installation in the house." And he has been able to use it, and we still use it today.
It still works.
Yeah, it still works.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. I didn't think that would be possible. Good gracious. Now, in terms of each of these gentlemen that we talked about, Robert Clark, of course, he's sounds like he virtually built Annan with him and Davidson and his son. We can thank him for the library. And Mr. Fraser had some rather memorable descendants as well, you told me.
Well, his daughter was a very bright young woman, and she went to the University of Toronto and got admitted to the science faculty. And how she did that, she had to sort of bully her way in. But and she was early in her career, and unfortunately, she died in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. But his son Wells Fraser, went with the Bank of Nova Scotia and was a branch manager in several communities in southern Ontario until he retired, I think in the 50s.
Okay.
So they were a very accomplished family.
Clearly. And all of that history just running through one house. It's a remarkable sort of locus.
Exactly.
All right. And we're going to talk a bit more about the process of discovering all this after a quick break. So Frank, this is a remarkable series of sagas, all this history just coursing through this one house. What was the process for you finding out about it? How did you get interested? Where did you go? What did you do?
Well, I'd heard stories about the church being very proud of the 100 years that they'd had the manse, and I met people in the church who had worked on the property, had done various things. So I went over to Grey Roots, and I started at Grey Roots. And first of all, I had the property description, and I got the deed, the original deed, and with the additions over the years, and then a few other facts. And I was very sorry that there were only like a handful of pictures of Annan, and none of the manse. And then the Women's Institute, which was an organization in Ontario, I think it still has a couple of chapters. Lady Tweedsmuir, the wife of John Buchan, coached them on doing community history. So there are many, many community histories that have been done. And Grey Roots has the Annan community history, the original Annan community history. So there are lots of stories in there. And they were based on documented records, so they were fairly reliable. I went down to the United Church Archive in Toronto and researched what they had on Annan. And of course I went to the cemetery, because the first 4 couples who lived in the house, the Clarks, the Frasers, blank, and the Roses, are buried there.
Oh, okay.
So I got their dates, and I was able to, from their dates, able to find out something about their families.
Okay.
And Dorothy Fraser is buried there with her mom and dad. And so I got curious about why is this young woman who died in 1918, what's the story about her? And I was able to find, and then there's a remarkable, thank goodness, fairly reliable book by a guy named Ross, Al Ross. And Ross Moyne at Leith is his family. Okay. Ross Moyne's a property, and it's named for his family. And Ross wrote a book called Reminiscences of North Sydenham, Leith, Annan, a couple of others. Okay. And so there are some Annan stories there. And they're fairly reliable because they're based on Ross going around in the mid-50s and talking to people.
Was Dorothy's story, considering how it was cut a bit short, was it in there, or did
no? I got that. I got that out of the Toronto Star pages of the past. Believe it or not.
Oh my goodness!
Because I got her obit.
And okay, wow.
And you go to the library here, and you can go through the papers. And I got Fraser's obit and Clark's obit and Dorothy Fraser's obit, and you have to go through the. I'm a journalist, so. Enough said, but
yeah.
I've spent days there going page after page after page in every reference to Annan. So the Women's Institute, Grey Roots, the newspapers, the cemetery, and the book. Those are my primary sources.
And a very tidy set of them as well. What about Mr. Fraser's editorials? You said he wrote editorials.
Yes, I've read some of those.
Yeah. What does he editorialize about?
Well, he wrote what in those days was called The Lead, which was the first editorial every day.
Right.
And so I went through no bylines.
Oh, okay.
But the lead editorial would be on some news story that week or that day, and what the Owen Sound Sun-Times thought of it.
Okay.
So they were just editorials like you would pick up today. Current events, politics, municipal affairs, people.
All right. Is he any ones stick out? Was he particular? Did he have any particularly interesting views? Anything like that?
No, I think he had I would say he was the typical Owen Sounder or North Sydenham mentality of fairly conservative, with a small c. Fairly values oriented. You can read in his editorials that he's a Christian. But in that day, that wouldn't have been that unusual.
Yeah, it would have been pretty standard operating procedure, I imagine. And and of course you've also gone into the house itself. So people, if I know these medicine bottles in particular, you can find out enormous amounts about the companies that make them. And just one more time, there's a collection at a fellow at the hospital has.
And he's the pharmacist. He's
Pharmacist,
the
pardon me, yeah.
So if you go into the public pharmacy on the main floor, just inside the doors, and look up on his shelves, he's got a collection of
And
these.
is he, and for anybody,
He's fairly knowledgeable.
and he's willing to take questions from people who want to inquire, because I know there's.
Just insist,
Aha, okay.
because he's a great talker
Is he indeed? Okay, good stuff.
and a good man.
Yeah, no, and these are, and it's astonishing what you can find out as well about the histories of the
I'm looking
company.
on
companies.
the bottom of this to see if there's a recycling.
Yeah.
But no.
Maker's mark of some sort there.
There's a maker's mark of some sort.
And I, as you tipped my hand there, I've made some of these, and you can, in the summertime, you can go to Grey Roots and watch them make the nails. And so you were able to, you dug these out during the building of the addition on your house.
Yep.
Is that right? Yeah.
There was a summer kitchen, and we tore that down to make room for the addition. And when we did the addition, my wife said to the carpenters and the contractors, make it as close to the original as you can. So the carpenter took a biopsy of these big baseboards, took them down to his lab, and made a computer, with his computer and laser, was able to make matching door frames, window frames, and baseboards.
Wow. All right. The old and the new, as it were.
And the stonemasons who did the brickwork on the extension, they looked all over and were able to find a brick that was close enough to the original brick, which has been there since 1880 and weathering, but close enough to the color that I think in maybe 10 years will
Be hard to see. Yeah. Having found all of this out about the house, how does it feel to you to know that you're living in the midst of all that history? What's the feeling that you get when you think about that?
Well, I love history,
That makes two of us.
and I did for the Canadian Petroleum History Association. I've done a lot of work in a couple of books, and so the feeling that is that you are the steward of the property. And the property is long before you, and if you take good care of it, it will be long after you. So I'm looking into whether or not I can get one of those heritage plaques on the
wouldn't that be
house,
something, yeah.
which kind of restricts what the next buyer can do.
Oh well, and they'll have something good, whatever state, whatever happens if they've got one of those. Well, Frank, it's a remarkable saga of discovery and wonderful stories of the past. So, thank you so much for telling them to us. And note for anybody watching who's in an older house, you got an idea where to go if you want to find out how many stories you're sharing your house with.
Well, I've enjoyed tonight.
All right, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.